The best thing probably that ever happened to me, he gave me a prescription for meditation, and he said, take
Hmm.
15 minutes every morning, every evening, and sit down quietly, and then we'll talk about what comes up while you're trying to quiet your mind. And over time, that process of quieting down my mind, sitting still, and listening, to what was coming up, it was in those moments that I realized, yeah, the fire department isn't going to work long term. Because I started basically listening to myself more deeply, and the message I was getting back was, this, and this doesn't fit with your personality, so it's not going to work in the long term. So that's what led me to that realization, and it was a little gradual, but that was definitely sort of the turning point. Was have a meditation practice.
Welcome to the podcast. Nathan Newberry here, your host. I have Nick. Nick, you have a unique last name. I want the audience to know how you say it the right way. What is it? Nicholas, how do you say it?
Svaikauskas, which is
Sivoskas.
his last name. Yeah.
But you're going to tell us a little bit about your story today. I want to dive into it because you have a unique one. You have a local market that you serve. Before we go into your story and understand a little more your success, help us understand a little bit more of what high performance, what does that look like in your world? What does that mean?
Yeah, when I think of high performance, I used to train in biathlon. If you've seen in the Winter Olympics, cross country skiing and shooting, and we would
Mm-hmm.
train actually with the Canadian and the Olympic and the American Olympic teams. They'd be just at our training camps. We'd be chatting with those guys, and what I picked up from them, which really stuck with me, was when they've trained for 4 years for the Olympics, and they have one day, they have to perform on one day, and for them, it doesn't matter how they wake up, how they feel that day. None of that matters. It's not up to their external circumstance. They make it happen. So they have the attitude that they're going to perform, no matter what's going on, equipment problems, things aren't going their way that day, they're still going to perform because it's one chance out of 4 years. And so that's what I think of in high performance, is that you're going to deliver regardless of what else is going on externally.
So adapted to challenges and really kind of optimizing everything for that one official day. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and being able to pull out that performance really on any given day. So it doesn't depend on, everything, a thousand things lining up perfectly. They're ready to perform at all times.
I love that.
Yeah.
Now tell us, the audience here, what you do, because you have your own personal brand, but you also have built this amazing company that like serves the clients. Tell us a little bit about what you're known for. What do people know you for?
Yeah, so my company locally here in Calgary, Alberta, it's called Calgary Custom Concepts, and we take boring rooms and make them beautiful. So our specialty is interior trim work, carpentry, and we do a lot of accent walls like you can see behind me. That's sort of the niche that we fit into here in Calgary. And I got into that. I trained as a carpenter. I went to school. I did, for 2 years. I did the apprenticeship for 4 years. Did all the training. Worked for a custom home builder and renovator. And what I liked the most was the fine millwork and woodworking. And I said, if I'm going to start a company, then it's going to be doing my favorite aspect of the job. So that's what led to trim carpentry and millwork as the business.
And that's grown and expanded quite a bit. You have an online, presence that's pretty large. Tell us a little bit about how you had to build up to that.
Yeah, so that I have to go back to the background of that. So I finished all my training as a carpenter, and when I was as my summer job when I was in college, I was a forest firefighter, and so we got out, and this was in Ontario, so I grew up in Guelph, Ontario, and we would get deployed out to here in Alberta. Actually, they had a big fire in Fort McMurray in the Northwest Territories. We'd get sent out, and that was a really fun job. I graduated college. I said I better get a job in my field where I studied, and it didn't take long for me to realize, you know what, I miss the camaraderie and the challenges of being on a fire department. And one of our clients at the time, actually, I got into a conversation with him. He said, hey, you should join the local volunteer fire department, which I happen to live close enough to. which I did. So I joined that, and I really enjoyed that. And the first time I got on a fire truck, lights and sirens going, we're racing down the highway. There's a barn. It was a barn on fire, but doesn't matter. And I was so excited. I said, "Oh my God, this is a job that people get paid to do. I want to do this." So from that date, it was a year later, and I got on the full-time fire department in the city I lived in. And um, so that was once I finished my apprenticeship. I started on the full-time fire department, and I had also been wanting to start my own business doing carpentry. I had the side jobs going on like a lot of guys do, and I thought, okay, perfect. Now on the fire department, you work two 24-hour shifts a week. I'm going to have all this free time. So that's when I incorporated, started my business, made it official, and I was doing those two things side by side. And then it took me a couple of years on the fire department to realize it wasn't quite the right fit. I love the job. I love the people we work with, helping, serving the community. But sort of my disposition was, I'm really always looking for growth to make improvements. And in this 200-year-old institution, which is the fire service, there's not much room for that. It's very rigid, hierarchical, structured. You don't, in our city in particular, the only way to get promoted and to advance was for somebody to retire or somebody to die. So
Uh,
there isn't opportunity to advance based on merit. And I thought, well, I feel very limited. I feel, boxed
hmm.
in here. And I realized I was going to have to make a choice. Either I stick this out in this career for 30 years or I take the business full time. And
What was
to
that
me, the
day
choice was,
like?
what's that?
What was that day like when you realized that? Was that like on a walk? Was that driving? Was that journaling? For you to understand, hey, I got to make this big leap and jump, and I got
Yeah,
to transition out of
that's
what you like
that's a
most.
great question actually. And that's going to lead to another story. So they had prepared us. They give us a lot of training on the fire department in terms of mental health, of dealing with trauma.
Mm.
So they have a lot of supports available today, which is great because they didn't used to. So I had a therapist, and I wasn't very open to this previously, but I thought, I better have someone to talk to just about issues. And I ended up talking to this guy about my business and business trouble. And the best thing probably that ever happened to me, he gave me a prescription for meditation, and he said, take
Mm.
15 minutes every morning, every evening, and sit down quietly, and then we'll talk about what comes up while you're trying to quiet your mind. And over time, that process of quieting down my mind, sitting still, and listening, to what was coming up, it was in those moments that I realized, yeah, the fire department isn't going to work long term. Because I started basically listening to myself more deeply, and the message I was getting back was, this, and this doesn't fit with your personality, so it's not going to work in the long term. So that's what led me to that realization, and it was a little gradual, but that was definitely sort of the turning point. Was have a meditation practice.
That's unique. That definitely is. And that just from that you were like, hey, I got to go all in. That's interesting,
Yeah.
man. Did you come from an entrepreneurship background? Was your parents or family siblings or anything,
No,
have they
no.
jumped
So
into it?
so not entrepreneurs. My parents are from Argentina, so they're immigrants. I'm a first generation Canadian. My dad is a developer for a robotics company, so he's a senior developer, and so he's a programmer. And my mom is a physicist at the University of Guelph, and she works at particle accelerators and doing X-ray stuff, and very non-entrepreneurial.
But those
Um,
are high level jobs. So you came from a background of like your parents probably pushing you for greatness, or at least cultivating a level of hard things. Would you say that
yeah,
that's
yeah,
true, or
definitely. There's the expectation of performance, and they set the example. They did hard things. They picked up in the 90s from this country, and they went through a military dictatorship in the 80s, and they
hmm,
said, all right, we're going somewhere better than this. So they picked up, came to Canada, didn't speak English, didn't know anyone, and then they made it work, and landed into their careers. So yeah, there's definitely, they set the example there, I think.
now leading that into you were an athlete, then you went into firefighting, which is very similar. It's tactical, but being athletic, and then you're building a business that is doing hard things with carrying wood and tools and everything like that. Are you or is that fun to work a lot with your hands, or are you now transitioning into a point where you're thinking about working on your business more than you're working in it?
So it's definitely fun for me, and yeah, I have the build. I was told you're built for firefighting, um, and I was good at that aspect. So I like that, but 100% now I'm dedicated to working on the business, which means being off the tools, which I love
Right.
being on the tools, but I also love running the business, talking to clients, sales, marketing, all the other hats you have to wear. So I'm willing to delegate, the physical aspect to the guys. And honestly, the guys I have are better than me at what they do on the tools. So yeah, I'm happy to move into that role that's non-physical. It's more that you have to use the brain,
Yeah.
but I'm very
How
happy
was
doing
that
that.
transition? How was that transition? Because most of the time, when people are building a business, most of the time the reason why they fail is just because people don't adapt to growth. They stay in the trenches where they're working in it, and the capacity is limited to their own time, which equates to the dollar amount that they take home. You've had to grow and expand this quite a bit. Was there something specific that people told you? Was there programs or books, or your just realization that you had to make that big shift with going pro, in essence, of going from you doing it yourself to building this business, building an online presence? Like, how did you adapt to that? What was that
Yeah, that
like?
process itself was, a learning process and painful at times. So I knew from, I love to read personal development and business books. So I knew the point was going to come where, yes, you have to get off the tools, delegate that. And my first attempt failed, backfired basically. I hired a couple guys, so I had an apprentice, and then I hired a senior, like a lead carpenter, who's very experienced. I hired the first person who walked in the door. So I didn't vet them, I didn't check references properly, and they ended up not being qualified, underperforming, souring relationships with clients. So I had to let them go. And then I was in sort of this painful limbo where, yeah, I have to do the work, and the more that I'm on site performing the work, the business is suffering because leads aren't coming in, the marketing's not being taken care of. So I was in this painful state, and I pictured myself as being in a catch-22 where I don't have enough money to hire, and I need to hire someone to make more money.
Yeah.
But then I had this conversation, and actually, his name's Mike Jasper, and he's an entrepreneur from California. I had him on my podcast, and we had a little conversation afterwards. And he said, "What's your biggest challenge right now?" And I gave him that same example. So I need to hire someone, but the money isn't there. And he said, "Okay, let's work through it." And he took me through, how long do you think, if you hire, a lead carpenter, somebody skilled who can work on their own, how long would you expect it would take for them to be making you money, get onboarded, get familiar with the work? And I said, worst case scenario, 3 months, probably a lot less than that. And he worked through. So even if I had to borrow the money to carry the costs, it's still going to be worth it in the long term because he's going to earn more than the interest on that money. And that conversation gave me the kick in the butt to say, okay, I can't just be afraid of making the same mistake. I'm going to do it again, pay more attention this time. And it ended up working out great. The guy I hired is great, and he was making money off from day one. So that was sort of the transition, and that allowed me to step back and really be completely off the tools and just manage the projects, run the company.
Yeah.
So that was sort of the painful learning phase, and then the transition, and then it's been great since then.
And you've written a book. It's not related to necessarily carpentry at all, but what was the inspiration there from you building this business? You have an online presence. You have a podcast you're by yourself too, but then you also are shifting into writing books. Like, what was that about?
Yeah, so this will go back a little to your earlier question of, uh, yeah, how did the company, find its growth? So when I quit the fire department to run my company, I had comments. I had people say, "This is going to be the worst decision of your life." The common comment you get when you get hired on the fire department is you just won the lottery. It's a safe, secure job with career. It's completely resistant to economic cycles, really. So strong unions, and so and I had felt sort of limited in that job. So I felt that when I went full time into the business, I had to go like a bat out of hell and just perform and you know blow everyone's expectations out of the water to prove that yeah, it wasn't a stupid idea. So that was the first thing I did. Was This is my book, Optimism 2033. When I moved out to Calgary, I called it my sabbatical. I took a week off and I said, this book's been, brewing in my brain for some time. There's a lot of things I want to share. And I knew I had 1 week off. And this is right before they got married and before we actually officially moved out here to Calgary. Uh, so I sat down for that week, 8 hours a day, wrote, and this is the product
You
of
wrote
one
a
week
book in
worth
a
of writing.
week, Nick? Wow.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
impressive.
yeah.
That's cool, man.
And I had a deadline, and I knew I wasn't going to work on it afterwards. I did the editing and the cover and the publication happened afterwards, but that was the time I had to write, and I said it's got to get done then. So that was very focused session to get that
Where
done.
does all of this drive come from, Nick? To perform, to be optimal, to be a high performer? Is this internal drive? Is this, your upbringing? What's wiring you in such a way to push toward growth? Because oftentimes, even when people get to a certain level of success, they just like they sit in those laurels and just be happy with that success, and they just kind of ride it out. What's this constant growth mindedness that's constantly pushing you toward these edges of limits to push things further?
What I always have in mind is I want to fulfill my potential. And I have that, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs have this, is that they see potential all around them. So I see potential in opportunities, in people, then I see it in myself, and it's way, way up here. There's this unlimited potential, and I'm here, and so I'm always trying to close that gap. But I think, yeah, but I wasn't always like that. Like I'll take you back to an experience I had when I was 18. I moved out to Ottawa to train full time in biathlon when I was competing, and so I ended up at a summer job sealing driveways. So spraying the tar on driveways, door to door sales, and I think it was not very long after I started, a couple weeks after I started there, and it was kind of a sketchy company. I think everything was going on under the table with them. And they said, "Hey, do you want to go out to Montreal to do some driveway sealing? Because there's no competition out there, so we can go out there and clean up." And I said, "Okay, sure." So we loaded up into a van, headed out there. They said, "Oh yeah, we'll get some hotels for everyone to stay in." And the hotels ended up being, they were basically shanties. Like it was just some shacks on an island near Montreal, and it was just these filthy, nasty shacks with an empty mattress in the middle of the shack. And so we're out there working all day, come back covered in tar in this black bitumen tar, to these shacks. And the people, it wasn't the greatest characters in that group. There's everyone's drinking all night. There's drug use. Well, even during the day on the job. And one of the guys had come in that morning for an interview, and they said, "Yeah, get in the van. We're going to Montreal. You're hired." And so, he had the clothes on his back and his backpack, and I remember he didn't make any money that day, and he had whatever change in his pocket from the day, and so we're lying down. I'm pretty sure I was sharing a room with him. We were lying down to go to sleep on this bare mattress in this shack, and I was like, I'm in the wrong place. Like I'm not meant to be here. This is not where I want to be. And I think that was one of the turning points where I said, this is sort of like the worst case scenario where you could end up, and I don't want to be here. And that sort of put me on the trajectory of what else is possible. How can you fulfill more potential? Yeah, since then, and I would say, yeah, around that time is sort of where I started working on myself and working towards, higher aspirations sort of in all aspects of life. If that answers your question.
What was the new standards you had to live by? Like you adapted learning, you're already a fit guy, but what are some of the things that you had to incorporate to build where you're at right now and even the future of? Like what were some habits that you had to install or get rid of, or things that you had to really kind of implement for that success to happen?
Yeah, there was a lot of habits, and what's interesting is sort of after that I got into, really into personal development. I started going to Tony Robbins events. I volunteered at one of his events. I was on the medical crew since I had the fire department medical experience, and I started reading a lot. And I struggled with that at first with the personal development because I was just trying to pile on, this new knowledge, these new techniques or habits onto what I was already doing, which I had bad habits. I had these negative habits, and it took me a while. And I said, why isn't this working? Doing all this personal development stuff and reading these books. That was definitely the number one habit, was reading. And when I got Audible, so I don't know how long Audible's been around, but I've had it for a long time because I was not focused enough to sit down and read a paper book. So that was super helpful to have the Audible in my ear while I'm driving around. But what I really realized was you have to get rid of the old habits in order to install the new ones. Like, I like the language that you use. You got to basically uninstall those old ones, because otherwise, if you're just trying to pile on top of the negative habits, those are going to crush any progress that you make with with what you're trying to do. So that was a process, was just getting rid of the old bad habits. And I'm talking about, like, quit smoking, quit drinking, quit smoking pot, all those things. And then what's really interesting was I sort of found, I enjoy getting rid of these things that aren't bringing me towards my goals. And the new ones, some people might say extreme. I haven't watched a movie in probably a year. I haven't like, I don't watch the latest Netflix shows. I have no idea. I can't, I couldn't tell you what Game of Thrones or any of that. Um, and that comes to, having focus on what do I actually want to get out of my time. Because if my goal was to be a movie reviewer, then yeah, no problem, I'll be watching movies. But that's not in line with my with the long-term focus. So yeah, really cutting things out was one of the missing aspects, and then build the habits. And and now those look like, waking up at 5 every morning, working out every day, making sure to read every day, nutrition, supplements, everything to optimize your health and your mental state and clarity, so you can go through your day and do what you got to do.
Do you talk a lot about that in your book, Optimism?
Yeah, actually, so there's a chapter. Let me see what it's called, but I gave the analogy, and it's, a Formula One car, or it needs high grade fuel. A
Mm-hmm.
fighter jet, it needs Jet A. You need jet fuel. You can't feed it diesel. You can't feed it crap. And so the analogy is, your body's the same thing. You have to, if you want your body to perform at a high level, you need high level inputs. And then if you want another example, the programming analogy, garbage in, garbage out. So
Mm-hmm.
that goes even beyond just your body. What are you putting into your brain? So if you're consuming garbage, if I'm going home and watching Family Guy and The Simpsons, that's the information that's rolling around in my brain. It's getting it into my subconscious, when you go to sleep and your brain processes what you've been through during the day. And I heard a long time ago, whenever you have to make a decision, throughout your day, some it might be something like 80% of that decision is going to be based on what you've consumed in the last 24 hours. So then that really got me thinking, what am I watching? What am I listening to? What's on the news? What's on the radio in the background? Because all of that content is getting assimilated and it's in there floating around.
Mm-hmm.
And if I want to make higher quality decisions, I have to have higher quality inputs into your mind, so that information is available. And that really got me focused on, yeah, paying attention to what I'm learning, reading, listening to.
How often do you assess that? Because more often than not, as entrepreneurs, we charge ahead and we're growth minded, but we oftentimes like leave relationships in the dust, challenges, situations that we probably need to deal with before we actually moving forward. And it actually leaves some casualties and some shrapnel in the wake of some of this. Do you have a process that you go through with trying to identify, hey, here are my goals, and I'm just going to run ahead without making sure things are dialed in and aligned? Do you come back and assess some of these habits or some mental things or relationships? Because you're married now, your wife is pregnant with your first, like things are moving in toward that direction where there's more growth in a lot of different areas. How do you take stock? How do you kind of assess where you're at and where you're moving toward?
Yeah, there's a couple things I do actually there. One of them, which is pretty recent, within the last year, I have a learning plan. So I used to have the framework where, this book is on sale on Audible, or I happened to hear this get recommended recently, so that's going to be the next book that I read. And it was haphazard, so I was just reading whatever happened to come up. And so a coach of mine suggested, well, have a learning plan. So I wrote down, what do I specifically want to work on? So it might be relationships, it might be sales, which means I need to consume more sales content. And every day I have a planner and I'll write out, there's a little section for a learning plan. So what do I want to learn today? And now I'm actually being conscious about, is what I'm looking at and reading relevant to, my bottleneck, or to the most relevant need in the business or personal. And the other aspect, which I got from a coach, he's actually in BC, so just northwest of both of us. But he calls it the 7 buckets. So family, home, your vocation, your finances, relationships, and then mental, physical, and spiritual. So the 7 buckets, and he goes through and he has a little chart, and he'll do an assessment and say, how am I doing in these 7 buckets? Rate them each out of 1 to 10, because those are all the essential aspects of life. And then, make sure, as you mentioned, that you're not neglecting one of them, that you're pouring into each bucket. And if one of them is getting low, then you need to go and put some focus on there. If your relationships are getting neglected, then go and focus and pour into that, because if any of those gets unbalanced, then it's going to drag problems into the rest of your life. So
Do you do that like on a quarterly basis or something, where you're assessing where you're at with all of those? Or yearly?
Yeah.
How do you go about that?
I don't actually have a specific date, but I'll look at it really every day and sort of
That's good.
see
good,
where
man.
things are at. Yeah.
I love the wheel of life and trying to go through and assessing that. I think that's a really good thing that you're doing, because then that'll allow you to kind of prioritize the right things. Well, Nick, it's been super cool to learn from you around what you do and what your past looked like. How can people connect with you further?
Yeah, best way to connect is Instagram. It's Nick Svike, so NickSvaik.
I'll put all the links down below here too.
Yeah. Yeah, and then same thing, you can go to nicksvike.com. There's links to the book there on Audible. If you can figure it out how to spell Nicholas Svaikauskas, you can Google that, because there's only one of those in Canada. So I think I'll come up.
Super cool. Well, Nick, it's been a pleasure meeting you and getting to know you. I hope a lot of people gleaned some really good high performance habits and skills and other ideas that they can help trigger and apply them to life. Guys, thank you for listening in. And we're on our journey to another 1,000 more. So stay tuned. We'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks for having me, Nathan. Appreciate it.
Yeah, man.